Dzień dobry Państwu, witam bardzo serdecznie drugiego dnia Europejskiego Forum Nowych Idei w Centrum Konferencyjnym hotelu Sheraton. Tych z Państwa, których nie widziałam wcześniej na sesjach plenarnych. Szanowni Państwo, to dla mnie prawdziwy zaszczyt móc wprowadzić, przedstawić osobę, która będzie teraz miała wykład "Co dalej z euro?" profesor Leszek Balcerowicz. Wielkie brawa. Autor reform ekonomicznych, gospodarczych. Ja wątpię, żeby trzeba było przedstawiać profesora Balcerowicza, ale tak dla porządku. Był wicepremierem, ministrem finansów w pierwszym rządzie niekomunistycznym po 1989 roku. W latach 2001-2007 pełnił funkcję prezesa Narodowego Banku Polskiego. Obecnie jest przewodniczącym Rady Forum Obywatelskiego Rozwoju oraz kierownikiem Katedry Międzynarodowych Studiów Porównawczych SGH w Warszawie. Guru dla wielu z nas.
Thank you.
Bardzo proszę.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have 1 hour 10 minutes because then I have to act according to the schedule and I have to leave for Warsaw by car. I won't take the whole time. I will make an introduction for about 30 minutes, 35, then the rest is yours. Now, I am not going to engage in prophecies. That's too dangerous. But I am going to discuss certain problems. First, starting with simple observations about the Eurozone. There is a popular expression, there is a crisis of the Eurozone. But is it true? This would mean that all the countries in the Eurozone are affected by the several serious problems. But this is not true. We have distinctly two different groups of countries. First are those who have problems, which I am going to discuss. They are now called periphery, or Southern Europe, you know, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Southern Europe, Spain and Italy. But on the other hand, you have so-called Nordic countries, Germany, Finland, Austria, Netherlands, very different situation. So one should not generalize too much. These countries which have problems, they develop two kinds of crises. I am not going to bother you with all this.
That's fast.
Now, you can distinguish two types of crisis depending on the sequence. The first type is called the financial fiscal. So first financial, then fiscal. And this is the Spanish or Irish type crisis. I'm going to discuss that. The second type is a Greek type. It is fiscal and then financial. And the first. Now, the proximate cause of both types of crisis is excessive spending. And whenever you have excessive spending, it's always financed by excessive credit growth. So in this type of crisis, you have the private sector boom, which was the housing credit boom, as I said, in Spain, in Ireland. And this boom has fueled economic growth, but also the bubble. The bubble have one characteristic. They cannot grow forever. So they burst. And then accelerated growth turns into deep recession. And during the boom years, the tax revenues are increasing faster than normal. And they are spent. In Spain, 2007, there was a budget balance. But then 2 years later, it was 10% of GDP deficit, a very, very strong reversal. And so recession produces fiscal problems because tax revenues fall in a dramatic way, while spending, which has been inflated, is usually not cut as dramatically as the revenues fall. Now, there's a very little doubt about the proximate causes. Excessive credit. There is a much discussion about root causes. And the popular interpretation, especially in some media, but among many economists, is that this excessive credit growth was due to some market failures. But the question is it true? It is very easy to engage in cheap moralizing, condemning these awful people who are called bankers. Of course, to be sure, there are some awful people among them, but the percentage of awful people among the bankers is probably not higher than the percentage of awful people among the politicians. Or perhaps even... Now, but on a more serious note, there's a lot of empirical research which shows that among the root causes of credit booms are wrong policies. And this is just a list. There's a lot. For example, Fed has lowered interest rates too much and kept it too long. This has contributed to the credit boom. Credit became too cheap. Second, there was an aggressive subsidization of housing credit in the US. How is this called in Poland? Rodzina na swoim. Remember, wrong policies have always very attractive names. So there's a very clear measure. If something sounds very good, it's usually very bad. And too big to fail. So you have huge financial conglomerates, which if they run into problems, no politician would dare to liquidate them. But where did they come from? Are they a product of the pure markets? No. They are products of years of policies which consisted in bailing out larger institutions. This, of course, has convinced the markets that it's, the credit risk premiums is lower. It's less risky because there would be a bailout. So these large institutions were financed by cheap credits from the financial markets. But operational financial markets was distorted by the public intervention, and so on and so forth. We can come to that. Now, the second type of crisis is a Greek type, and it's the proximate cause. It's a systematic overspending. Not 1 year, 10 years, 15 years. If you have systematic overspending, then you have to borrow as a state. So you accumulate public debt until the bubble bursts. Sometimes because of external events. This was the case of Greece. And what happens then? Fiscal crisis spills over to the financial crisis. Why? For the simple reason that these deficits have to be financed by credit. And who is offering credit? Financial institutions, including the banks. What is more, there are official regulations, there has been official regulations still in force, which produce privileges for the government. So the banks are officially encouraged to lend to the government. There are 5 types of these perverse regulations under the Basel I, Basel II, and Basel III. And there's this being proposed to be maintained. So there's no correction in this respect. But what are the deeper reasons? Yeah. By the way, if you have systematic overspending, it is always welfare spending plus public administration. Systematic overspending does not mean that you spend very much for culture, because it's very little. 80% of public spending in OECD, more or less, 70 or 80% is social spending, various kinds. So here's the reason. But what drives excessive spending? Here, you have to look at the nature of political competition. And in many countries, political competition is destructive. What does it mean? Very simple. People vote for Santa Clauses in politics. They behave like children. They believe that the state can only distribute benefits without the costs. They believe that the state is the God, like, you know, the miracle, multiplied goods. Now, these tendencies differ in strength in democracies, but they are almost always present. In countries when they are stronger, you have the Greek scenario. But by the way, the present crisis in Greece is not due to any special Greek mentality. Why? Greece has two periods in its history. The first one, 1950 until 74. And during that period, there was a budget balance in Greece, low inflation, and one of the fastest growth in Europe. What happened next? Mentality has not changed, but politics has changed. There was one person who was a theoretical economist in the most abstract economics, which is the welfare economics. The bigger the state, the better. And his name was Georgiou Papandreou, the father of the recent prime minister, and he was very gifted populist. So if you are blessed by gifted populist, you are in danger. Because they are cheat. They have great capacity to cheat people. Normally, if you cheat people privately, you would be in prison. But if you cheat people politically, you are re-elected. By what people should behave like children. So can be changed, but not only from within the political system. Look at political competition in Poland. Do you see any serious debate on the problems which exist? For example, a danger for slowing down economic growth in Poland because of internal reasons, not external reasons. Demography, falling investment rate and falling growth of productivity? Not at all. What is the main competition? Who is the biggest Santa Claus? Yes. And this has to be changed. This political culture has to be changed from within the civil society. And you have this destructive tendency in politics without constraints. So what are the constraints? Like in the Polish constitution. The public debt cannot exceed 60% of GDP. By the way, we should be very proud, especially in Germany, because they think they have invented that. But we have introduced that in 1997. By the way, this is the best part of Polish constitution. And the biggest constitutional reform would be to limit Polish constitution to just this one article. Why? Because most of other articles are Santa Claus's type. They promise what the state would care about you, wsparcie, wsparcie, care, deliver, provide, etc. Where from? Where is the money coming from? So as you can see, at the root causes of the fiscal financial crisis, we have some deep political problems, which cannot be remedied just by simple technical solutions. It requires a mobilization of good part of the civil society to change political culture. If you do not do that, then other groups in society, which are very fond of others' people money. Some people like others' people money, especially if it is distributed via the state. So they press for that, or they press for the protection against competition. As a result, competition declines and growth declines. So without the mobilization of civil society, even in democracy, growth slows down. I do not want to say that non-democracy is better. On average, it's worse. And the worse dictatorships are much worse than the worst democracies. After all, there was no democratic Stalin, no democratic Mao Zedong, even no democratic Fidel Castro, and no democratic politicians were allowed to speak for 5 hours, like Fidel Castro was allowed to. Okay, so solutions have to be found within democracy by using civil freedoms which are connected to democracy, much more mobilization against the harmful expansion of the state, and this goes beyond the Eurozone. Now, let us move outside the Eurozone and ask the question, are the problems which appeared in some Eurozone countries absent outside Eurozone? No. Outside Eurozone, you have a similar division into the periphery and the Nordic. But periphery is very special. What countries belong to periphery, meaning they have serious problems? United States, huge housing boom and huge fiscal deficit. Britain, huge fast fiscal boom and financial boom and fiscal problems. Iceland. And who belongs, what countries belong to the northern type? Canada, Mexico. What a satisfaction to the Mexicans to say to the Yankees, well, do badly. Sweden, Finland. Sorry, these are outside Eurozone but within in the European Union. So the problems are not specific for the Eurozone. But does it mean that there is no link between some features of EMU, common currency, and the fact that problems appeared in some Eurozone countries? Is, in other words, the idea, the mechanism of common currency completely innocent? No contribution to the crisis? No. There are two links. And one of them was overlooked widely. The first one, let me start with this fiscal financial crisis, which is the Greek type. What has happened in the southern countries? Before entering the Eurozone, they have to pay very high interest rates. Italy, Greece, Portugal. But once they enter the Eurozone, they obtain a huge benefit, windfall gain, because they started to pay low interest rates. Instead of using this benefit to reduce spending and the deficit, they increased spending. So they consumed these benefits. Why did they do that? Because a very important constraint, which is called Stability and Growth Pact, was violated by everybody. The irony of history is it was violated by Germany and France. So it was free for all, and in the respective countries, there were weak domestic constraints. So no external constraints, no European constraints, no domestic constraints, and this tendency to vote for Santa Clauses. So this is first link. This link is not due to some faults in the design, but in the implementation. In the design, you may find some faults. For example, before creating EMU, the Germans wanted to have automatic sanctions, meaning you exceed the threshold, you pay the fine. But the French said no, and the Germans agreed. And as a result, who imposes sanction? Future sinners have to impose sanctions on the actual sinners. So this was faulty from the incentive points of view. By the way, there is not much in prospect. The automatic sanctions, because again of the French insistence, are not included, to my knowledge, in the fiscal pact. What about, so countries like Greece, Portugal, to some extent Spain, obtain the windfall gains and consume them because of the non-existent constraint. By the way, I should mention that there was a third problem in the Eurozone, accumulation of distortions. More and more regulation distorting limited competition. Anti-market regulations, and as a result, growth has slowed down. This is the main problem of Italy. Italy does not have huge budget deficit, has huge public debt. And the main task for Italy is to deregulate. to reintroduce competition, but also to reform the Italian courts, which are perhaps worse than the Polish ones. They can be worse courts than in Poland. And these distortions accumulated also in Greece and in Portugal. Why? Because if you get cheap money as a politician, you have a very weak incentive to reform. That's human nature. You postpone, most people postpone hard decisions. Now, coming to the financial fiscal crisis, like in Ireland, in Spain, what is the link between the Eurozone construction and financial boom, which was overlooked? If you have common currency, you can have only one central bank under the modern money system, and one central bank can have only one level of interest rates at a given time. Now, this level of interest rate may be too low for some countries. And if it is too low, then credit grows too fast. This was seen, but it was regarded as an asset and not as a danger. And I must say it's true of National Bank of Poland. They overlooked this. It is also true of International Monetary Fund. They overlooked this danger. But we see that it has been a greater danger, as witnessed by what has happened in Spain and in Ireland. What is the solution? Well, there's a lot of technical work to be done, how to make credit more expensive for countries where interest rates are too low. And the solution has a special name, which is a macroprudential regulation. I give you one example. National Bank of Poland, has introduced one macroprudential regulation. We have seen that housing credit denominated in foreign currencies is growing too fast. So we introduced special regulations making this credit less accessible. This is the Polish subprime. In the US, they did it the reverse. They make the credit more accessible to people who could not pay it back. This is American socialism. You know, in every capitalistic economy, you have enclaves of socialism. In America, you have housing policy. In Spain, what is the enclave of socialism in Spain? The name is cajas. These are non-private banks, which have accumulated lots of losses because they were politicized by the regional authorities. For example, they have built lots of new airports, but there are no passengers. By the way, in China, they are going to build 70 new airports, but they also have built highways with very few cars. So China sometimes is regarded as a country which is not subject to economic laws, which is a grave mistake. But this is a digression. So there were these two links, I think, between problems in some countries of the Eurozone and features of common currency. I will come to the question whether this is curable or incurable. But first, let me now briefly mention policies which have been pursued in the Eurozone during the crisis. And these policies can be divided twofold. First, European level and national level. And second, with respect to each level, we have two kinds. One is called crisis management, policies which aim to mitigate the crisis. The second is structural policy, prevention of future crises, etc. So at the European level, for example, you have fiscal rules which aim at preventing future crises, and you have various kinds of bailouts, meaning official credits which are offered at lower interest rates than those which are demanded by the markets. At the national level, you have various rescue operations, but you have also, to a different extent, depending on the country, reforms. Now, my view is that there has been excessive bias at the European level and the European bailouts. You know, the word European is like a magic word. if you call something European, is good, regardless of the content. This is the Euro speak. You've noticed people who live a longer time in Brussels, they acquire a new language, Euro speak. It was present, very visible. Now, let me explain what I mean by this dangerous bias, that the solution is seen as the European bailouts, either by European stabilization mechanism or, which is the worst solution, and I am coming to that, by money printing by the European Central Bank. This bias has two sources. First, interests. Financial markets, some speculators, in a neutral sense of the word, they can obtain short-term benefits, financial benefits, by pressing for bailouts. Most of the media love new visions. The bigger, the better, regardless of whether this makes sense or not. And many politicians would like to postpone difficult decisions by obtaining easy money. And I am coming to that. You see that very visibly. But there are also wrong beliefs. There may be actual fallacies, and there are two. The first, the popular vision of the financial markets. This popular vision is expressed by metaphors. One metaphor is contagion. It is borrowed by epidemics. Another one metaphor is domino effect. It's borrowed from physics. But metaphors are not theories. But they are treated like theories. And they express one idea. Once financial markets are disturbed, they act as a blind, undiscriminated force. If this is the case, what should you do? Introduce big bazooka. You know this, big bazooka. So military metaphor. So you have biological metaphor, physical metaphor, and military metaphor. And you have Hollande as a candidate who was his main enemy, declared financial markets. Can you imagine that? Financial markets. So this view of financial markets leads leads the proponent of this view to treat them in categories, them or us. Yes? Who will prevail? Now, is it true metaphor? No. Because if they were true, then Germany would pay the same interest rates as Greece. But clearly, there are differences, and the huge differences. So markets discriminate between countries, even though they do it imperfectly. But International Monetary Fund has made lots of mistakes. And this is the best institution. So even the best institution makes lots of mistakes, and these mistakes should be compared by the mistakes made by the markets. Now, the second, even more important point is that markets, to some extent, consider effects of future reforms. So you do not have to wait 20 years till pension reform would bring benefits. There are some expectations. And this can be seen, I can show you how yields which are charged by the market react to reforms. They decline if you introduce credible reforms and sufficiently broad. But if you postpone, you have to pay the same price. Compare Greece with Ireland. Different story. Compare Greece and Portugal with the Baltics and Bulgaria, which are the most radical reformers during the crisis. By the way, what is the solution for the Greek problems? To send the Bulgarian experts. They are very good. And they are from the neighboring country, the same Balkan culture. So it's very easy solution. They are very close by. Now, the second fallacy, which is very popular, is that people say, well, reforms, meaning fiscal reforms, structural reforms, of course, they are necessary, but they can bring about benefits in the longer run. But what about the short run? What is left in this view? Bailout. But this view of the effects of reform is false. Proper reforms, not can bring about two effects. Longer run, meaning you increase productivity through competition, you increase employment through labor market reforms, but they bring also the short-term reforms, which are confidence. If market lose confidence, how can you regain confidence? With words? With cheap money from outside? No, with actions, which are called reforms. And these differences, these confidence effects are, again, reflected in the dynamics of the yields, and there are huge differences. Now, so I would say that instead of pushing for more and more bailouts, there should be much more emphasis on reforms in the respective countries. There is no European solution for the Italian problems, but there's Italian solution for Italian problems. More reforms, and there are excellent Italian economists, mostly abroad, like Olesina or Giavazzi. Some of them still in Italy, like Pagano. They know what to do. They have to push this with politics, together with Monti. There are some very good Spanish economists. So if there are problems, the problems are not the shortage of economic proposals. Even the most difficult situation has economic solutions. In Poland, we have much more dramatic situation than in Greece, but there were economic solutions. If you have a problem there at the political level, with postponing reforms, so one has to act at the political level to push the politicians. Now, I mentioned, and let me develop this, that I consider massive money printing by ECB and other central banks like Bank of Britain as a disease which a longer run is worse than as a medicine which is worse than the disease. And let me say why. Okay. First of all, the very popular claims that central banks can and should solve countries' problems are based on rhetoric and not on evidence. And there are three tricks. You can see that. One, lend of the last resort before the crisis meant that the central banks lended to credible banks which have liquidity problems. Right? It was stretched to lending to the governments. It is a completely new situation, but the same name. So people think it is the same solution. It is completely different. This is a manipulation or a trick. The second is from psychology, the notion of framing the decision. Depending how you present the dilemma, you may induce people to choose different options. What is a very popular trick? It is like that. If you don't do that, there is going to be a catastrophe. So everybody prefers something else to catastrophe, but it's no analysis. This is just a trick. I remember the same was with fiscal stimulus in the US. The argument was, if you do not do that, it would be a catastrophe. And people usually do not say what they mean, because it is very difficult to explain. And thirdly, just to say that other people are doing the same. But this is not an argument. This is what I think why. A more massive money printing to buy government bonds of the troubled country is a solution, is a pseudo-solution. And this is more dangerous than in England or in the US, because one of the main problems in the Eurozone, or more broad the European Union, was that the treaties were concluded by violated. So this has created the confidence deficit. And how you remove this problem was violating treaties even more, because it's a violation of the treaties regarding the central bank, European Central Bank, if not in the letter, then clearly in the spirit. And finally, remember enthusiastic voices that finally European Central Bank starts to print money. Yes, Draghi was praised by Martin Wolf in Financial Times, which always praises cheap money policy. and loosening of fiscal policy, very strangely for financial times. Now, how many days then, in reaction to this, the Spanish yields and the Italian yields have fallen? For how many days? 4. 4 days. And then what? They return to the previous level because by using aspirin, you do not treat much serious diseases. And previously, there was a massive expansion of European Central Bank money. It was cheap loans to the banks, LTRO, and it was used massively by Italian and Spanish banks to buy Italian and Spanish bonds. What was the effect? 3 weeks. And then yields returned to the previous level. So this is empirical evidence that if it is a solution, this is a solution for a couple of days or weeks. It cannot substitute for genuine reforms, which is removing the root causes of the problems. And other effects is that you inevitably politicize the central banks. And if you read, for example, what is Prime Minister Rajoy doing nowadays? Besides discussing Catalan problems. He's meeting the president of France, and they issued a communiqué urging the ECB to be more active, meaning printing more money. And ECB does that, we have effects for 3 days or 3 weeks. So I think this is surely a bad economic policy, but I think it is also bad politics. Because if you exhaust this for 3 days, 4 weeks, what comes next? More pressure for more money printing, etc., etc. Okay, so solutions lie elsewhere than in the money printing. But finally, let me move to the last point, so as to leave time. I mentioned that there were certain links between features of EMU and problems in some countries of the Eurozone. Some of them were not specific to the Eurozone completely. So for example, the capacity or predilection to spend too much. And the solution should be look at the national level first of all, meaning trying to change political culture and imposing bans on public debt, which is being done in some countries. But there are certain claims, especially among some Anglo-Saxon economists, that the original blueprint of EMU was fatally flawed. It is incurable. And there are 2 assertions to this point. First, people say monetary union requires political union, and they think it is obvious, but it's not. And the second statement is one monetary policy cannot fit all. They think it is an explanation. Now let me tackle each of these statements, and then I finish. First of all, what is monetary union? And what is political union? Monetary union can mean that you have just one money, one central bank, but it can have a broader sense that each country have separate currencies, but they cannot devalue. So they are hard pegs, like in the Baltics, or like under the gold standard. And the broader concept is, I think, much more useful because it leads you to the observation that there were in the past hard pegs areas which are quite successful for 50 years. The most successful was the gold standard. I am not saying we should return to gold. This is a separate issue. It's not a nonsensical idea, but politically very difficult. I am saying that we have some precedents to EMU, the gold standard, and they survived for 50 years, and they were destroyed by political shock, which was the First World War. But they functioned quite well. Why? First, because there was fiscal discipline, which was a norm of decent behavior by the politicians. This norm has been destroyed by Keynes and the followers. And second, flexible economy, especially flexible labor markets. So if you suffer a shock, you adjust. And this points out to the solutions, which, by the way, are being tried under the structural programs. What is political union? Usually people do not explain that, but one can think that they mean single federal state. If this was the only solution, EMU would be doomed to failure, because there is not going to be a single federal state in Europe, whether you like it or not. By the way, who is the more dangerous to the European Union? Eurosceptics or Euro enthusiasts? Euro enthusiasts are much more dangerous to the European Union because they are trying to impose solutions which are not accepted by most of the populations. And they create protests. Like, for example, you remember European Constitution? The elites of European enthusiasts tried to impose, and it was rejected. Now, why a political federal state in Europe is not very likely? Because federal state has one feature, which is completely impossible, I think, in the foreseeable future: large common budget. What is the common budget in the European Union? 1%. And you see problems with going beyond 1%. What is the common budget in the United States? 20%. You cannot impose larger common budget ahead of the growth of European identity. And you cannot artificially increase this process. If you try to increase it, it will backfire. And we have some warnings in some countries. Italy, north and south, you have tensions. Why? Because of transfers from the north to south, which were largely wasteful and financed mafia. Belgium, you have almost a separation. Why? Because the Flamands do not want to continue the transfers to the Wallons. Spain, Catalonia. So these are warnings. One has to be very careful with imposing solutions. Europeanization should be organically increased, but not abruptly from the top. And we do not need a single federal state to save the euro, because it was not the lack of large common budget which has introduced or contributed to the Greek problems, but the lack of discipline and the lack of flexible economy, and these are the solutions. Now, the last point is, that's true that one monetary policy cannot fit all, but it is a fatal flaw. There was, in fact, one common monetary policy under the gold standard or under the euro-based currency boards, and they survived. So even though it is a complication, I don't think that it condemns euro to the demise. And finally, what are, I think, the right economic solutions which should be pushed to the politics? Less bailouts, more reforms. And if you engage in bailouts, you may weaken the incentive to reform. Constraining the central bank in printing more money, which is, as I said, the worst kind of a bailout. And having in mind not just a federal state in Europe, which is non-realistic, but a group of states which have single market, like it was under the gold standard, and each of them have flexible economy and fiscal discipline. So one should put the focus on the respective countries, especially when the problems are. So summing up, one cannot prove that EMU was completely fatal. And one cannot prove that the downfall of EMU or Eurozone is certain. And what happens, as I try to explain, very much depends what is going to happen in the respective countries. And notice we have huge differences. Not everybody agrees. Ireland is doing much better. Portugal is doing much better. Italian problems are less severe than Greek. And the Baltics and Bulgaria, which are similar to the southern countries of EMU, which in the sense they cannot devalue, have introduced radical reforms. And they are going out of the recession. Thank you very much. You have 25 minutes. Yes.
Panie profesorze, podkreśla pan kilka razy dzisiaj, że więcej jest potrzeba reform, a mniej bailoutów, więcej śmiałych decyzji ekonomicznych, a mniej polityki i wtedy problemy gospodarcze czy kryzysu będą możliwe do rozwiązania. Mam takie pytanie konkretne dotyczące Grecji i Hiszpanii. Czy w pana ocenie dzisiaj poziom planowanych i realizowanych reform tam, niezależnie od tego, czy są wymuszane sytuacją wewnętrzną, czy też przez Komisję Europejską, przez Fundusz Walutowy, czy ten poziom reform jest wystarczający od strony ekonomicznej, a jeżeli jest, czy widzi pan miejsce jednak na jakieś kompromisy polityczne? No bo trzeba się liczyć też i z faktami, prawda, że kraje te...
Dobrze, zacznę od tego, co to znaczy liczyć się z faktami.
Z faktami społecznymi.
Ja rozumiem. Facet ma gruźlicę. To jest faktem. Ale nie podobają mu się antybiotyki. Chciałby mieć aspirynę. Co jest właściwe? Z powodów społecznych nie chce brać antybiotyków. To pan się zgodzi na kompromis polityczny, że bierze aspirynę i będzie pan go zapewniać, że tego wyleczy z gruźlicy? No chyba nie. W związku z tym trzeba wiedzieć, jakie kompromisy, czy kompromisy, które mimo wszystko dają wystarczającą szansę, żeby wychodzić z choroby, czy kompromisy, które są zgniłymi kompromisami. Czyli trzeba zawsze zaczynać jak w medycynie. Co trzeba zrobić? The best treatment, or second best. I wtedy nie ulegać presji, że na przykład w Grecji ma pan bardzo wojownicze związki zawodowe i lewaków przypominających naszych niektórych związkowców na czele prawicowego związku zawodowego. I w związku z tym, no, wobec tego w Grecji nie można zastosować terapii, która jest konieczna, żeby ją wyleczyć. To jest odpowiedź na temat liczy się z faktami. Co znaczy liczy się z faktami? A jeżeli chodzi o to, są duże różnice w stopniu zaawansowania reform i tak jak powiedziałem, do tej pory w Grecji w stosunku do programu było znacznie mniej zrobione niż w Portugalii, Irlandii czy Hiszpanii, nawet w Włoszech, czyli są negatywne. Być może w Grecji na przykład wielkimi oporami ogranicza się administrację publiczną. Dlatego, że rozszerzanie administracji publicznej było głównym środkiem rywalizacji między partią prawicową a partią lewicową, z których każda była socjalistyczna, tak jak, no nie, już nie będę tych analogii snuł. No ale i teraz, ponieważ ich interesy, one są tam związane z tą administracją, to ciężko im idzie. Po drugie, w Grecji jest dużo do sprywatyzowania, tylko do tej pory prawie byłoby niemożliwe, dlatego że tych punktów weta było z 10. No, prawie nic nie sprywatyzowali. A mają co? Nie muszą koniecznie sprzedawać wysp Niemcom. Są również inne obiekty.
Bardzo dziękuję, bardzo proszę. Tu jest mikrofon na środku i najpierw pan, później pan.
Could you give us your opinion about the gold standard regime? Because these ideas are surfacing from time to time in the debate. So, what's your opinion?
Well, opinion have to be based on facts. And facts are given by good empirical literature. My reading of this literature is that it functioned reasonably well, and that the gold standard, the room for maneuver for central banks was limited, and it was good because the room for mistakes was limited. There were, of course, recessions, but not very deep crises, and there was a quick recovery from the recession because economy was much more flexible, and finally gold standard was liquidated by the First World War. It was suspended, and then the return was not to the gold standard but gold exchange standard, which was different, which was much more politicized. And then we have a great recession, which by the way was a great recession only in some countries, United States, Germany, France, but not Britain, Scandinavia for various reasons. And on the urging of Keynes, gold standard was liquidated. So Keynes has two large contributions. Legitimation of large fiscal deficit and condemnation of gold standard, because everything which limits the state was bad for him. Constraining the state was bad because state is good. So if you constrain something good, it's bad.
Bardzo proszę.
Very simple logic.
Marek Groskrut, Ernst & Young. I will have one question and one comment. Starting with a question. Since indeed it is macroprudential policy that should play a critical role in stabilizing the economy, but not only within monetary union, but also in countries outside monetary union. And as for that, the question is whether initiatives such as CRD4 directive, although amended during negotiations, fortunately, but also even movement towards banking union, although we don't know the details at this moment how this banking union would look like, they could actually weaken the power of a domestic supervision over financial institutions, those that come from abroad, especially in the Polish economy. Would you consider this as a threat to the effectiveness of a Polish macroprudential policy at this stage? And a comment on the fiscal policy. Indeed, in case of countries such as Italy or Greece, almost prior to entering the euro area, almost 20% of government expenditure it was spent on debt servicing costs. And actually, after having entered the euro area, these costs went down to 5, even below 5% of their spending. And indeed, these benefits were consumed instead of improving their structural balances. And actually had this problem actually related to many other euro area countries, and had they implemented a very basic fiscal rules that would ensure that general government expenditure grew in line with expenditure with average domestic growth, GDP growth, they wouldn't have encountered that problem we are currently experiencing. Unfortunately, within the six-pack that has been in force since December 2012, there is an element of the directive that imposes, although not directly, on countries that we should implement such a fiscal rule that would ensure that their expenditure doesn't exceed, their growth doesn't exceed GDP growth. And I would also comment that within six-pack, which also reformed Stability and Growth Pact, the element of automaticity has been strengthened, although still, I was personally involved in negotiating this six-pack.
Congratulations.
Some countries indeed opposed these changes, but to some extent they succeeded to the extent that this process still can be politicized and thus become ineffective.
Okay, thank you.
Now, questions. Grateful for comments. On question side, well, I did not say that macroprudential regulation is needed only in the Eurozone, but it's needed especially in the Eurozone. For one fact, that in the Eurozone there are countries for which the ECB's interest rate will be too low. If Poland enter Euro, the interest rate would be too low, which would produce a risk of excessive credit growth, and what to do? You have to introduce some special regulations, and the work is not finished, in my mind. Second, in this proposed directive on the financial sector, there are some positive and some doubtful parts. Positive, in the longer run, is increasing capital in the banks as a buffer. Negative, to my knowledge, it's preserving the perverse regulation of Basel regarding the special treatment of the sovereigns vis-à-vis the banks. There's completely no justification, which shows that the largest pressure group is the state upon the regulation and the other. Banking union. Well, some people in the European Union, especially in the Eurozone, believe that the solution for the crisis is to present a bold vision without content. So this is the banking union. It has to be bold. Whether it has content or not, it is secondary. You would make markets gain confidence if you are bold. But what about the content? And now it is, originally in this bold vision, Europe had to expected to have first common European supervision, common restructuring fund to deal with banks in problems, and common deposit insurance. And there were some people who argue this is inseparable package. Now, I don't know whether you're right or not, but nevertheless. Now we have only the idea that European Central Bank would have an additional function of being a micro prudential regulator. I happen to be the member of the de Larosière group at the European level. We worked for over the year. We discussed various problems, and we are very much against European Central Bank taking over these functions, because we've argued that the ECB would be overburdened. Monetary policy, macroprudential regulations and supervision, and micro. And we rejected that. What was proposed instead was to create a sort of coordinating bodies at the European level called European banking authorities. And they were created only a year ago and started to function. After a year, we have a new bold vision without a content, really. And there's a lot of questions. What would be the vision of labor between national supervisors and the European supervisors? What about the competences of national supervisors? And for Poland, this is, I think, the more decisive criterion. We happen to develop pretty competent supervision. And we should not believe that every European solution is better than national solution. There has to be a very concrete analysis. Okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I like to, I'm Vilhjálmur Egilsson of the Icelandic Confederation of Employers, come from Iceland.
Yes.
Yeah.
You bring a special experience, I think.
Yes. But I like your analysis, and I tend to think about this in terms of vices and virtues, where ambition turns into greed. And where you have political ambition turning into political greed in some countries, and then, as in our case, where business ambition turns into greed. And fortunately, we are now being punished for our vices and rewarded for our virtues. But I would like to ask you about, I miss in this debate about the euro and the reform of the financial sector, the concept of orderly failure of banks or financial institutions. We are always talking about that if financial institutions have problems, we need a bailout because it is too disruptive for the whole economy if they fail. But why don't we discuss how we can make the failure kind of orderly, so that it would be that the creditors of the bank would take it over in an orderly fashion, either by convertible debt or some other instruments, so that the banks could go on with new owners if they failed?
Well, what you said has been applied, as far as I remember, in Sweden after the crisis in the early 90s, and in Finland. By the way, the recession in Finland lasted 4 years, and they reformed. In Sweden, 2 years. Now we have 2 quarters of a recession. It's a drama. There is a pressure for cheap money and bailouts. And in these countries have devalued, so perhaps it would help them a little. So this is a digression. If you ask me about whether there were failures or mistakes committed in some banks, of course the answer is yes. But this is not enough. What about the root causes? What regulations and what policies have contributed to excessive risk-taking by the private actors? And I presented to you an incomplete list of wrong policies. So if we want to reduce the danger of future serious crises, we have to eliminate these policies, and this has not been done, only partially. For example, monetary policy as a culprit is not discussed at all. The worse mistakes you do, the more competencies you get. It's a very fat, huge mistakes. Low interest rates and the Greenspan doctrine, which said that you can do nothing to prevent the bubble, but then you engage in massive cheap money, which of course encourages the bubble. And the central banks are exactly doing like that. And there are very few analyses in the mainstream economics which would point out to the future costs of this long-standing policy of a very low interest rates, which is a very bad model for Poland, by the way. This is my message to the Monetary Council in Poland. But there are some analyses being developed which show that if you maintain very low interest rates for a longer time, it slows down restructuring of the economy and economic growth as a result. This is the story of Japan.
You wanted? Yes, go ahead.
It is as old as politics that if the message is wrong, shoot the messenger. And this is more or less what is happening with the credit agencies. The only approach or the only tool practically that we have today to assess what is happening are effectively the credit agencies in spite of all their mistakes. Because if you follow discussions on economics or on budget in the European Parliament, then more or less you have just another discussion among politicians. I come from the European Economic and Social Committee where I represent employers, but I sit also with trade unions and with a large group of NGOs, whatever. And if you look there, in both Parliament and in the Parliament of the social partners, you will find that the demand is for more of the same, effectively. And you rightly said, the federation is practically what they are talking about, giving more powers to those who did it wrong, so that we give them more money to have more money to spend. How are we going to judge? Who is going to be the referee? Can we produce something more than just the credit agencies? And I say one point from experience. I come from Malta. It's a small economy, but relatively we've done well, even though we are in the south of Europe. So not all the countries in the south of Europe are in a bad shape. But we lost also our credit rating. We lost our credit rating not because of our own internal bad management. On the contrary, it was praised, but because we belong to the Eurozone. So there is something there missing. Who is going to judge? How are we going to do it? What are your ideas about this?
I have some ideas about credit agencies. Now, credit agencies have made serious errors, but not serious than International Monetary Fund. International Monetary Fund in 2008 went to Greece and said there are no fiscal dangers. This is a broader problem. You know, accounting rules are very important because depending on accounting rules, you see the problem or the problem is obscure. What is the accounting rules? What are the accounting rules regarding the sovereigns? It's like Enron. Remember Enron? Yes, they're more or less the same accounting rules, and they defend themselves against honest accounting rules. The sovereigns, the government. So one has to press on. So serious errors committed by rating agencies, but probably not serious then by, as I said, ECB, International Monetary Fund. The main problem was and continues to be our regulations, whereby the ratings have official power. So if you want to invest, being a pension fund or insurance company, you have to invest in bonds who are rated, high ratings. So if rating agencies make errors, these errors are multiplied by official regulations, which are still in force. This is not. Instead, what is being proposed? European rating agency, which of course will be much better than non-European rating agency. It is a farce. Yes, I can see too.
Yeah.
I'm not from Malta, but I'm from another. I'm not from Malta, but yes. I'm from another country in the north. It's the only country in the north that you mention in your slide, the Netherlands. In my country, people are sometimes pleading for a split of the Eurozone in the northern part and in the southern part. A euro, Northern European currency, and a what we call a euro. You have a view on that? Splitting the Eurozone in the north and the south?
I would not recommend it because I think there are economic solutions for the southern problems and one should insist on that. But I can imagine a scenario, this is not a recommendation, which is the following one. instead of pushing for reforms, there will be more and more bailouts, including the ECB bailouts, which would weaken incentive to reform, and which effects would last for 3 days, 4 years. So it was like that. If a dose is not sufficient, you assume that the medicine is correct, but you have to multiply the dose. This is a special medical approach. Fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus. It's not, for Krugman, nothing is enough. You know Krugman, yes? Everything is not enough, you know. So you have to multiply the dose. Now, so if this scenario, I am not saying this is going to happen. This is a sort of hypothetical scenario. So if bailouts continue more and more, and if reforms are delayed, then what the southern countries would demand? More bailouts. What the northern countries would say, we don't want. There would be growing political tensions. There would be voters in Germany, but not only in Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Estonia, Slovakia, Austria, would say, why should we allow more and more taxpayers our money to subsidize wrong policies? And then this is the danger. And not that there is not enough money printing. This is not a solution. This is a problem. Yes.
Krzysztof Stroiński, Deloitte. I have one relatively short question, but I would like to ask you this question in the context of a saying that one very important foreign politician mentioned, that, and that saying was, it's not that we don't know what has to be done, it's we don't know how we get re-elected if we do it. And the question is now, should Poland go to Eurozone, and when?
These are two not very related questions, but I try to link them through my imagination. On first, this sounds good, but it's false. It's a general rule, because it's not true, despite the popularity, that if you reform, you lose elections. In the Baltics, in Bulgaria, there are the bravest reforms. The government stayed in power, and they are re-elected. On the other hand, if you have growing problems, but you do not treat them through reforms, you lose elections. Because the situation would get worse in the popular perception. Opposition will criticize that even if it proposes worse solutions. And then the voters would turn. And this is something which is, I think, cannot be excluded in Poland if reforms are delayed. And one can point out to reforms. We should not only blame external crises for our problems, which are now not very visible but can become visible. There are three dangerous tendencies in Poland, which if not tackled through reforms would slow down economic growth. First, aging. So less people in the working age. The pension reform was brave. This retirement age was put up, but not sufficient to compensate for falling labor force. Second, our investment ratio is very low. It's about 20% of GDP. In China, it's almost 50%. I am not recommending Chinese solutions, but something in between. Why it is so low? We should ask what constrains private investment. Private investment is guided by expected rate of return. So what policies reduce expected rate of return? And you come to taxes, rates, complications, public monopolies, various regulations, which constrain rate of return. So one has to do something about it. Third, which is the most important force for growth in the longer run, and one where Poland was quite successful so far, increases in general efficiency. Economists speak of total factor productivity. Behind that, you have innovations, shifts, structural shifts. It is the rate of improvement during last year is declining. We don't know exactly why. But one can suggest that there's not enough competition. So the regulation is very important, but even more important. Why do you deregulate? because previously you regulate. So the production of bad laws is the root cause. And one has to press again from the civil society upon the politicians, which are producers of laws, to stop this production of bad laws. And probably one thing is, why do we have so weak links between universities and business? Because universities are modeled of 19th century system, plus you have total security of employment regardless of whether you do or not. So, which is the same goes for schools, by the way. So this lower level, upper level, this is a triumph of trade unions. So, which usually protect whom? People who are very good do not need trade union protections. Any other questions?
Well, we are out of time right now, Professor Balcerowicz. I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Bardzo dziękujemy.